The mountains do not care who you are. They do not care about your rank, your record, or the name stitched above your chest pocket. They do not care how many miles you have run, or how many hours you have trained, or what your instructors wrote about you in the files that followed you from one duty station to the next. The mountains of Kunar province in eastern Afghanistan care about none of it. They have been here for 40 million years. They have watched armies come and go like weather fronts, rising and passing and leaving the stone unchanged. Empires have broken themselves against these ridgelines, and the ridgelines have not noticed. The mountains will be here long after the last boot print fades from the last high pass. But on a morning in late October, when the temperature had dropped to 14 degrees overnight, and the sky was the color of a bruise finding its darkest hour, before the healing starts, the mountains were witness to something that gave even their ancient indifference a reason to hold still. A woman was tied to a tree, not a large woman, 5 feet 4 inches tall, 118 pounds, with dark hair matted across her face and blood dried in a thin line from her left temple down to her jaw. Her wrists were bound above her head with steel wire, not rope, not zip ties, but wire the kind used to secure cargo in the back of military trucks. And the wire had bitten through the outer layer of skin on both cuffs and left wounds that would need stitches if she survived long enough to receive them. Her feet did not touch the ground. The full weight of her body had been hanging from her shoulder joints for so many hours that the muscles along her trapezius and rotator cuff had moved past pain into a deep structural numbness that she recognized from her training as the body's last reasonable defense before something structural gave way. She had been hanging there for 19 hours. 3 men stood around her. 2 carried rifles. The third held a flashlight trained on her face even as the morning grew pale and the tactical need for artificial light dissolved into the gray dawn. He was asking her something in Pashto, then in English. His English was halting in some places and precise in others, which told her something about where he had learned it and how long ago. Last chance, he said, last chance to tell us something useful. She did not answer him. She did not scream. She did not beg. She did not cry or bargain or lower her eyes. She looked past his shoulder, past the rifles, past the line of pine at the edge of the clearing, and fixed her gaze on the eastern horizon where a band of copper light was slowly drawing a line between the mountain ridge and the sky. She was counting, not hours. She had stopped counting hours somewhere around midnight when the counting became counterproductive, and she had redirected that mental energy toward things that were useful. She was counting other things now: the rotation interval of the guards, the behavioral patterns of the man who asked questions, how his posture changed when he expected an answer versus when he had already decided the session was ending, the distance from her position to the nearest point of cover if her hands were free, the wind speed off the eastern face of the mountain, reading it against the movement of dry grass along the clearing's edge. She was still doing the job. The man with the flashlight said something to the others in Pashto. One of them made a sound that was not quite a laugh, more the exhalation of someone who has been awake too long and has found the situation less interesting than it was 6 hours ago. The sound moved through the cold morning air and dissolved against the rock face behind her without leaving a trace. She breathed in for 4 seconds, held for 7, released for 8. Her heart rate had been below 60 beats per minute for the last 4 hours. Her father had taught her that when the narrator's voice comes, it is the voice of a man who has stood on ground like this. A man who knows what it costs, not in abstractions, but in the specific physical permanent currency of things that happen to a body and to a mind and do not fully unhappen afterward. It is not a voice that performs the drama. It is a voice that has absorbed the drama and come out the other side of it quieter and more deliberate for having done so. In 19 hours on that tree, she did not give them a single word, not one syllable, not a sound that could be shaped into information. And when the extraction team reached her position just after dawn, what they found beneath the blood and the frostbite and the wire marks on her wrists was not what any of them had been prepared for. The youngest medic in the group, a 29-year-old named Prescott, would later say that what he found when he pushed back her sleeve stopped him in a way that nothing in 6 years of Navy medicine had ever stopped him, the way a locked door stops you when you were absolutely certain it would be open, when you had your hand already reaching for the handle before you registered that the door was not going to move. He was right about that. But to understand what he found and why it stopped him the way it did, you have to go back 6 weeks. You have to go back to a morning at Fort Bragg when the air was still carrying the last weight of summer and a woman walked through a gate and nobody knew what had walked in with her. Fort Bragg, North Carolina, the first week of September, The humidity that settles over the Carolina Piedmont in late summer was still present in the way of a guest who has overstayed but not yet acknowledged it, heavy and persistent in a way that made the early mornings feel thick. The unit had been operating out of a nondescript building on the eastern edge of the installation for 3 years. It had a designation, a chain of command, a deployment window to eastern Afghanistan, scheduled for 3 weeks out, and a vacancy in the one position that no operational team could carry into the field without. They needed a medic. The man who signed the requisition was Captain Marcus Briggs. Briggs was 47 years old and carried his age in a specific way, not in deterioration but in density, as though the years had compacted rather than worn him. Broad through the shoulders, economical in every movement, with the kind of eyes that have made decisions in the dark and kept every single one of them somewhere behind the gray, stored in the particular way that certain men store things they are not done with. He had been in special operations for 22 years. He had worked with exceptional people. He had also worked with people who were presented as exceptional and who revealed themselves under real conditions to be something considerably more ordinary. He had a clinical distrust of the difference between the two categories because the cost of getting that distinction wrong was paid by people who deserved better. The reason for this distrust had a specific origin. On the previous rotation, a medic whose evaluations used words like outstanding and demonstrates superior clinical judgment had made a series of decisions in a compressed situation that had cost one of Briggs's men his leg above the knee. The evaluations had been accurate about the man's technical skills in controlled settings. They had not been accurate about what happened to those skills when the setting became uncontrolled and the time available for decision-making went from minutes to seconds to the kind of interval that can't be measured because it moves faster than clocks. Briggs had reviewed the incoming medic's file the evening before she arrived. He read it twice, set it down, looked at the wall for a moment, and then read it a third time. Her name was Tessa Wade, 25 years old, Navy corpsman with an advanced trauma certification and 2 previous deployments, one to the Horn of Africa with a Marine reconnaissance element, one described in the file with the deliberate vagueness that meant the details were in a different file at a different classification level. Her fitness scores placed her in the top 8% of her cohort. Her performance evaluations used the expected clinical language, and then in one entry written by a senior medical officer who had apparently decided that the standard vocabulary was insufficient, used a phrase that Briggs had not encountered before in an evaluation of a combat medic, unsettlingly calm under conditions that would justify the alternative. He read the file a 4th time. He did not sleep especially well that night. She arrived at the gate at 06:15, which was 45 minutes before she was expected. The security desk called the building, and Briggs's NCO came to his office door and said the new corpsman was already there. She came in carrying a pack that was disproportionately large for her frame-wearing service dress that was pressed without being performative about it, with her dark hair pulled back in the way of a person who has made this decision enough times that it no longer requires a decision. She was smaller than her file had suggested, not in the sense that the measurements were wrong, but in the sense that numbers on a page don't convey the specific quality of presence that a person has. And her presence in this building, surrounded by men who averaged 6 feet and 220 pounds, was quiet in a way that was either negligible or was something else entirely, and Briggs did not yet know which. He introduced her to the room with the same economy he brought to everything. Name roll deployment window. He told her the team would need 72 hours to assess fit. After that, he would make a determination. She looked at him and nodded once. She did not produce credentials, did not offer context for her file's less specific entries, did not perform the subtle, practiced confidence display that most people, good people, capable people produce when they are aware of being assessed and want to influence the assessment. She simply occupied her space and acknowledged the terms she had been given. Staff Sergeant Kowalski was leaning against the far wall with his arms crossed. Kowalski was 38 years old, built with the structural solidity of a man who had spent 2 decades ensuring that his body could perform what his profession required of it, and he had been with the unit long enough that his opinions about incoming personnel carried weight, whether he voiced them or not. He was not a malicious man. He was a direct one, and there is a version of directness that serves the unit and a version that serves the person being direct, and Kowalski had not always been careful about the distinction. He looked at Tessa Wade for a moment and said to no one in particular that the new medic looked like she had come to take someone's blood pressure. Nobody laughed, but the silence that followed had a texture that was not quite neutrality. Chief Petty Officer Callard was standing near the window on the far side of the room. Collard was 44 years old, with the particular stillness of a man who has learned somewhere in the accumulation of his career that the most valuable thing you can do when a new situation arrives is to watch it carefully before you put your hands on it. He had served in units and circumstances that had sharpened his capacity to read people in the way that certain kinds of experience sharpen certain kinds of perception, not by adding something, but by removing the interference. He watched Tessa Wade receive Kowalski's comment and do nothing with it, not absorb it with visible discomfort, not deflect it with practiced ease. Simply let it pass through the room like weather and continue standing where she was standing. He filed this. Later that morning, when she was carrying her gear to the assigned quarters, Collard walked the same corridor at a useful time. Her large pack shifted as she set it down to work the door, and the top flap moved, and for less than 2 seconds, he saw what was inside. A box of .338 Lapua Magnum rounds sealed, placed in the pack with the precision of someone who packed the way they thought each thing where it needed to be for a reason that had been considered. She had the flap closed and the pack lifted and the door open in the time it took him to take 2 steps. He continued down the corridor. He did not mention it to anyone. He did not forget it. The 72 hours that Briggs had allocated were not procedural. The team ran their standard readiness, sequence equipment, verification, communication drills, physical assessments, tactical map work, medical inventory. The kind of sustained evaluation that looks routine from the outside and is designed to be revealing from the inside, because what it reveals is not whether a person can perform tasks, but whether they perform them in the way of someone for whom the tasks are an expression of something genuine, or in the way of someone for whom the tasks are a performance of something they want to be believed about themselves. Tessa Wade moved through the 72 hours with no visible effort toward impression. She was doing the work. There is a difference between those two things that is difficult to articulate and impossible to fake for more than a few hours, and the men in this building had spent enough of their careers in proximity to both that they could feel the difference. The way you feel the difference between wood that is solid and wood that is hollow, not by looking at it, but by putting weight on it. On the second morning, during a movement drill through the obstacle course at the south end of the compound, Specialist Stanton went down. Stanton was 22 years old, 4 months with the unit, and had come up through a Ranger battalion with evaluations that described a young soldier who was developing into something more than adequate. When he landed hard on his right knee against a timber barrier, a slip on a damp section of the course, the kind of thing that happens and that no amount of training fully eliminates the initial read around him was straightforward. A bruise. The kind of impact that heals in a week with ice, and the standard tolerance for discomfort that the environment selects for. The medic who had preceded Tessa on the team had made similar reads on similar injuries twice. Both times the injury had been worse than it appeared. The second time it had cost a man his rotation. Tessa was across the course and kneeling beside Stanton before anyone had called for her. She did not ask how it felt. She did not ask him to rate his pain. She ran her hands along the lateral aspect of his knee with a sequence of pressure points and range of motion tests that had been calibrated by years of practice to extract specific information from specific tissues, and she read his face the way a person reads a face when they are looking not at the expression someone is managing, but at the involuntary data that lives beneath it. She was done in 30 seconds. She looked at Stanton directly. Lateral meniscus, she said. Posterior horn, partial tear. You run on it today, and you're in surgery before the deployment window. Stanton looked at her with the transparent skepticism of a young man who very much did not want this to be accurate. Kowalski, standing to the side, said something at a volume calculated to be heard by everyone, except technically directed at no one. That afternoon, the base orthopedic imaging confirmed what she had said. Lateral meniscal tear, posterior horn, partial thickness. Conservative management for 6 weeks minimum, with surgical consult if it didn't progress on schedule. Briggs received the report in the early evening and read it once. He picked up Tessa's field medical submission and read it 3 lines technically exact, written in the shorthand of someone for whom the format was second nature rather than a template being filled. The diagnosis, the recommendation, the clinical rationale, nothing that wasn't necessary, nothing that was performing thoroughness. He set it down. He said nothing to anyone. But something in his assessment had revised the way a weight-bearing calculation revises when one of the variables turns out to be different than estimated. Kowalski was quieter the following morning than he had been, not in a way that most people would notice, in a way that Collard noticed. The 5th day brought a map exercise. The team was working through a terrain analysis problem, a hypothetical approach to a high-value position in a landscape that resembled the operational area they were 3 weeks from entering. The exercise required the integration of topographic data, weather modeling, pattern of life intelligence, and the kind of judgment about human behavior in specific terrain that does not come from a manual and cannot be reliably taught in a classroom. Tessa had taken the seat at the end of the table, not because she had been directed there, but because it was the position with the widest line of sight to the map display and the most complete view of everyone else in the room. Collard had noticed this. No one else appeared to. She was not speaking. She was listening in the active way, not as passive receipt, but as the kind of reception that continuously processes what it hears against an existing model and produces something more than the sum of the inputs. Kowalski was working through a movement corridor analysis and cited an elevation figure that was wrong by 220 feet. Not dramatically wrong. Wrong in the way that errors are when they emerge from density of data and insufficient sleep, which Kowalski had been carrying for 2 nights. Tessa said without looking up from the notes she had been making, the corridor sits at 4,420, not 4,200. The difference puts the approach inside the shadow cast by the northern ridge at the relevant time of morning, which changes both the visibility conditions and the thermal profile for anyone working the objective from elevated observation. She had not looked at the map when she said it. Kowalski looked at the elevation data. He looked at the map. He looked at her. She had already returned to her notes. Something moved through the room. Not a dramatic shift. The men in this room were too professional for theatrical moments, but the particular silence that follows a baseline assumption being quietly revised by a fact that was simply and undeniably there. Collard looked at his coffee for a long time. That night, Callard stood outside the main building at 2100 hours. The installation had settled into its evening rhythms, generators, perimeter vehicles, the specific quiet of a base at night that is not silence but is its own kind of order. He was not outside by accident. Tessa was at the far end of the exterior wall near the north corner, facing out toward the open ground. She was not looking at anything specific. She was doing what a specific kind of person does when standing in an open space reading it. The distances between points of cover, the angle of the overhead lights, and the geometry of the shadows they created. The position and rotation arc of the security camera above the east entrance. The approach vectors from 3 directions. She was doing this the way other people breathe, without deciding to. In his career, Callard had been in proximity to people who possessed this quality with different degrees of completeness. He could count on one hand the individuals in whom it was total, fully internalized, operating below the threshold of conscious choice, present even when the person had every reason to believe they were not being watched. One of them had been a contract advisor he had worked with briefly in the early 2000s, whose name he never learned and whose capabilities he had never seen fully matched. One was himself on his best days under optimal conditions. One had been a man named Daniel Wade. Collard went back inside and sat with that information until he was done with it, which took a while. 3 weeks later, the team was in Kunar province, and the mountains were doing what mountains in Kunar do in October, being cold steep and organized entirely for their own purposes, rather than for the convenience of anyone attempting to move through them. The terrain had been worked over by 30 years of conflict and carried a second geography, layered over the physical one cleared fields of fire observation positions, the buried institutional memory of everyone who had ever fought here, the specific hazards that accumulate when a landscape has been used as a battlefield long enough that the battlefield becomes part of the landscape itself. The first week was reconnaissance, pattern of life collection observation, no direct action. The team moved with the practiced discipline of people for whom moving quietly through difficult terrain at night has become a professional ordinary, not comfortable, never comfortable, but normalized in the way that sustained exposure normalizes things. Tessa moved with them, at their pace over their terrain, carrying her kit through conditions that make kit heavy in ways that don't show up on a training schedule. She ate when there was food. She slept when there was a window for it. She ran medical checks morning and evening and maintained the kind of continuous, low-grade situational awareness that the rest of the team over those first days began registering without articulating the way you register the quality of air in a space without consciously analyzing it, processing the information without putting it into words. Kowalski had been recalibrating since the map exercise. He had not said so. He had not apologized for the comment on the first morning, which sat in the ledger he kept for himself, in the way that certain men keep ledgers silently with the intention to balance them when the right moment arrived. He watched her work. He watched the way she moved through the reconnaissance operations. He was revising his original assessment in the incremental, grudging way of a man who takes his opinions seriously and therefore does not abandon them lightly, but who is also honest enough with himself to recognize when the evidence has exceeded the threshold his opinion was built on. On the third day in country, the situation that had been theoretical became real. A farmer 60 years old, give or take, working the edge of an irrigation channel his family had worked for generations, struck an unexploded device with the blade of his shovel. The device had been in the ground for at least 15 years, waiting with the specific patience of a thing that has no impatience and no awareness of time passing. It had waited for this particular combination of pressure and position and had found it in the movement of an old man doing what old men in this valley do when the season turns. The blast threw him 12 feet. The team heard the detonation from their position 300 meters north. Briggs had them moving in 40 seconds. The assessment already completed, device signature too small for a primary, too isolated for an ambush initiation, most probable scenario, a civilian casualty. He was right. When they reached the man, he was conscious but moving towards shock in the specific observable way of a body that has sustained significant trauma and is in the process of deciding whether it can manage what has happened to it. The damage to his right thigh had partially severed the femoral artery. The blood in the earth beneath him was communicating a timeline that did not permit extended deliberation. Tessa was kneeling beside him before the team had fully established their security arc. Her voice when she spoke was calibrated in a specific way, not gentle exactly and not clinical exactly, but occupying the precise register between those two things, where the human voice becomes a clinical instrument alongside the physical ones. She said, without breaking her assessment, sequence, femoral artery, partial laceration, class 3 hemorrhage, tourniquet placement, or unconscious in 90 seconds. No one questioned her. Not Kowalski, not anyone. The cat tourniquet went on at a speed that was the product of 10,000 repetitions on training dummies over years, the kind of repetition that moves skill beneath the level of conscious execution so that it operates with the reliability of reflex. 3 full rotations on the windlass, lock time marked on the man's forehead in grease pencil T and the timestamp, and she was already moving to the secondary injury pattern before the first man in the security cordon had settled into position. The farmer was alive when the medevac lifted off 48 minutes later. He was alive because of 90 seconds of work that looked to the untrained eye like nothing more complicated than efficiency. To Briggs's eye, to Callard's eye, and to Kowalski's eye, in a way that settled something that had been unsettled in him. Since the map exercise, it looked like the product of a mind and a pair of hands that had been doing this long enough that the work had moved past skill into something closer to nature. She was 25 years old. That night, after the team had cycled through the watch rotation and the temperature had dropped another 8 degrees, and the stars over the Kunar Valley had the density and clarity that altitude and cold produce, Tessa sat outside the patrol base for a time after the last medical check. She sat with her back against the outer wall, knees drawn up, hands resting in her lap. She was not looking at the mountains, though the mountains were there and large in the dark. She was looking at her hands. They were steady. They had been steady for as long as she could remember, in the specific way that her father had described steadiness, not the absence of feeling, which was a different and lesser thing, but the refusal to let feeling move your hands. That was the distinction he had drawn for her when she was 12 years old, in the difficult weeks after the worst night of her childhood, and it had been in the years since one of the most load-bearing things she carried. Her father, Chief Warrant Officer Daniel Wade. He had served with Naval Special Warfare Development Group, the unit the wider world knew as SEAL Team 6, for most of his adult life. His operational record existed in layers of classification that meant most people would never read it, and the people who had read it tended to describe it in the specifically restrained language of individuals who have learned not to use superlatives because the alternatives are usually more accurate. He had been in places and situations and moments that would have defined most careers, and that for him were part of a longer continuous record of simply doing what the work required for as long as he was capable of doing it. Within the unit, his call sign had been the Ghost, not because he was elusive in the performative sense, because he was the kind of operator who completed the objective and left the environment as he had found it, no trace, no debris, no echo in the local pattern of life that could be read afterward as evidence of what had happened. He moved through places that were designed to be impenetrable, as though the obstacles had been engineered for someone else against someone with different capabilities and different patience. He had been killed in March of 2011 in this same province in the 13th year of a war that had already accumulated enough dead that individual losses were increasingly absorbed into a larger aggregate of grief rather than standing alone. He was 41 years old. Tessa was 12. She had been shooting with him since she was 10. Not the way fathers teach daughters to handle firearms, not with the indulgence of a proud man sharing a grown-up thing with a child he loves. He had taught her the way his instructors had taught him, which was with precision and patience, and the consistent expectation of mastery rather than effort. He had started with fundamentals, breath position, trigger discipline, the understanding that the target was not the point, but the consequence of everything that preceded the trigger. Then he had added elevation, distance, wind drift, the specific mathematics of long-range ballistics that most shooters learn in theory and some learn in practice. Then he had added time pressure low, light, the problem of maintaining a heart rate below 60 when every physiological signal in the body is pushing it toward 90. She had been good at it from the beginning, not because of the training which was necessary, but not sufficient, because something in her, something that existed before the training began and that the training had found and shaped without creating, was built for the particular combination of patience and precision that the work required. She was built for stillness, for waiting, for the specific discipline of being entirely present in the real situation rather than the anticipated one. Her father had seen this and had named it for her once when she was 14, standing on a range in the blue Virginia morning after she had put 5 consecutive rounds into a group smaller than a quarter at 600 yards. He had not praised the shooting. He had said, "That's not the skill. The skill is the stillness. The shooting is just where it goes." She had understood intellectually at 14. She had understood in her body at 17, the first time she had been in a situation where the stillness had been tested by something other than cold weather and discomfort and time. She had understood the way you understand the ocean, not by standing at the edge of it, but by going all the way in. Then he was gone, and she had made a promise. She had sat across from her mother at the kitchen table in their house in Virginia, 7 days after the box had arrived with its specific government packaging that communicated its contents before it was opened. Her mother was a quiet woman who had married a man who spent half his life in places she couldn't know about and had built a life around that fact with the same practical acceptance that she brought to everything that couldn't be changed. She had looked at Tessa across the table with the expression of a woman who knows what is about to be said and has been preparing for it and is still not ready. Tessa had said she was going to serve, that she needed to. Her mother had said she understood. And then she had asked for one thing: be the one who saves them, not the one who ends them. Use those hands to put people back together. Tessa had honored this. For 7 years, she had honored it with genuine commitment rather than reluctant compliance, because she had found in the medical training she pursued with the same relentless focus she brought to everything that healing was not a lesser expression of what her father had given her, but a different expression of the same underlying truth that the work was to take care of the person next to you, whatever form that taking care required. The shooting was still present. That capacity did not atrophy from disuse. It had been built too deeply, practiced too long, integrated too completely into the structure of her abilities to be dissolved by a choice not to employ it. She maintained it in the private, specific way of someone who is not ready to use a thing, but is not willing to lose it. She went to ranges alone. She kept the proficiency current. She kept the box of .338 L'Appui at the bottom of whatever pack was currently her most permanent address. She had not opened that box in 14 months. She looked at her hands in the dark. They were steady. She went back to work. The intelligence arrived on the 5th day in country. A human intelligence source had provided information indicating that a convoy of between 8 and 12 armed personnel associated with a specific network responsible for 3 incidents in the previous 18 months, that the team's operational brief described in the careful language of classified reporting, was going to move through a particular valley corridor 22 kilometers northeast within 72 hours. The network was carrying a material that the unit had been specifically tasked to prevent from crossing into the adjacent province. Briggs spent 4 hours on the intelligence package. He ran the route analysis twice, cross-referenced the terrain study against the weather forecast for the relevant window, and held 2 hours of planning with Callard before he briefed the team. The plan was observation and interdiction. Reach the intercept position before the convoy entered the valley, establish the team in a position that provided clean sight lines to both approach routes, confirm the target package, and act. Clean, professional. The kind of operation that the team had rehearsed in versions of this terrain for months. They moved out at 0300. The route was 12 kilometers of mountain terrain at night, through the cold that comes down off the high ridges after dark and settles into the lower ground with the democratic thoroughness of weather that does not make exceptions. The team moved with the specific quietness of people for whom moving through darkness and difficulty has become a professional normal. They moved in single-file spacing, maintained communication and hand signals, and the minimal radio traffic that the situation required. Tessa moved with them at their pace over their terrain, carrying her kit and everything else that the mission required her to carry. Kowalski was directly behind her for the first 4 kilometers. He watched her movement not critically, not with the residual skepticism that was still working its way through his system, but with the observational attention that his years of experience had made instinctive. She moved well, better than well. She moved with the economy of someone who had been doing this specific kind of movement long enough that the efficiency was no longer a technique, but a habit, each step placed with purpose, each adjustment of her pack made in the minimal way that minimized energy expenditure and noise simultaneously. He had seen corpsmen who could handle the pace. He had not seen many who handled it like this. He filed this alongside the other things he had been filing. They reached the intercept position 90 minutes before the intelligence window opened and established in a rocky cut above the valley floor that offered clean sight lines to the 2 most probable approach roads. Briggs placed the security arc. Collard set the communications relay. Stanton and 2 others took the primary observation position on the elevated ground to the right. Tessa placed her medical kit at the center of the position in a location that gave her access to any point in the team's arc from any direction without requiring her to cross open ground to reach any of them. She had thought about this before she placed the kit. She had thought about it the same way she thought about every placement decision, with the specific logic of someone whose job was to be where she needed to be, when she needed to be there, and for whom that logic was automatic. She settled in. She waited. She was very good at waiting. The convoy entered the valley at 0612, confirmed target package at 0618. The team was disciplined, the communications were clean, the observation data was accumulating in the way that good pre-contact work accumulates, steadily building the picture that would enable everything that followed. It went wrong at 0623, not in one moment that could be pointed to afterward. In the way that things go wrong when a sequence of small events arrives faster than any plan can accommodate, and the collective effect changes the situation before the team can fully process that the situation has changed. A secondary element of the convoy that had not been visible in the initial count, using a channel on the eastern side of the valley that the observation position could not see. A communications intercept that arrived too late to be actionable, which would have, if it had arrived 10 minutes earlier, indicated that the convoy had been advised of observation from the north. A reflection from the high ground to the south, possibly optics, possibly metal, possibly nothing of tactical significance, that triggered the convoy's security element into a posture inconsistent with a unit that believed it was alone in the valley. Then the firing started. The team's position was engaged from 3 directions within 20 seconds. The geometry of the contact made the primary exfil route untenable immediately. The secondary route required crossing 70 meters of ground that was covered by a position on the far ridgeline that no one in the team had yet been able to fully identify. And until that position was identified and addressed, the secondary route might as well not exist. Stanton went down in the first minute, not from an aimed shot, from the kinetic effect of a round that impacted the rock face immediately to his left and distributed the energy of the impact across the left side of his body in a way that the body was not designed to absorb without consequences. He went down the way people go down when the body initiates the physics without consulting the mind, the involuntary collapse of a mass whose support system has been interrupted. He was 10 meters from Tessa. She moved. In the noise and the incoming and the controlled radio traffic of a team trying to identify and respond to a threat geometry that had changed faster than the brief parameters, there was a specific corridor of purpose that she moved through. Not because she was immune to what was happening around her, because the corridor was there and the work at the end of it was the work that mattered, and there was not a decision to be made. There was simply the corridor and the movement through it. She reached him in 4 seconds. The mechanism of injury was high-velocity impact transmitted through the rock surface. The clinical reality was proximal humerus fracture, with probable vascular compromise at the axillary artery, and the beginning of the hemorrhagic process that, left unmanaged, had a specific and unambiguous trajectory. She did not narrate this assessment to anyone. She worked it directly, moving through the intervention sequence with the speed that thousands of repetitions produces, packing the wound, managing the airway, stabilizing the cervical spine, as a precautionary measure given the force of the impact. Stanton stayed conscious. This was partly physiology and partly the specific effect of her voice, which she directed at him in the tone that she had learned from experience was the most effective, not reassuring in the way of someone minimizing the situation, but present in the way of someone who is fully in the situation and is managing it. "Stay with me," she said. "Right here with me. I've got you." He stayed. Around her from the ridgeline to the east, a sniper round impacted the rock face 6 inches above Briggs's head. Then another lower that forced Briggs into a different position. The team's suppression fire could not reach the ridgeline. The distance was wrong, the angle was wrong, the available weapons were wrong for what the ridgeline required. The sniper at 820 meters approximately had the angle and the range to disassemble the team's defensive position with the methodical patience that snipers have when the counterforce against them is inadequate. Everyone in the position understood this simultaneously. The Barrett M82A1 was in Callard's pack. Callard was 40 meters to the left, separated from his own equipment by a stretch of ground that was covered by 2 different threat vectors. He could not reach the weapon. And even if he could have reached it, the shot that the situation required was a shot he was not certain he could make at this distance under these conditions. He looked across the position. He found Tessa. She was still working on Stanton. Her hands were at his shoulder. Her eyes were reading the ridgeline. In the same moment, Kowalski looked at her. He had not arrived at what he said next through a process of deliberate reasoning. He had arrived at it through something faster and more immediate, the synthesis of everything he had observed over the previous weeks, the map exercise and the knee diagnosis, and the way she moved through terrain at night, and the .338 rounds that Callard had never mentioned, but had apparently not forgotten all of it, synthesizing in the compressed time of a contact that did not permit deliberation into a single actionable conclusion. "Doc," he said, "can you shoot?" The words went into the firefight. Tessa looked at the ridgeline. She assessed it with the automatic arithmetic that her father had built into her over years, and that 15 more years of private practice had made so complete that it operated without requiring her to think about it separately from everything else she was doing. 820 meters. Wind off the eastern face of the mountain, reading at 11 to 13 knots against the dry grass on the valley floor. The elevation differential. The angle of morning light creating a specific shadow pattern on the face of the ridge. She looked at Stanton. She had done what she could for him in this moment. He was stable for the next 5 minutes. What he needed in the next 5 minutes was not more medicine, it was the removal of the threat that was currently making his extraction impossible. She looked at Callard. He was already moving, not toward the Barrett, he couldn't reach it. He was moving to clear the line between his position and hers, pushing the pack across the rock surface. With a controlled force that sent it sliding toward her, it stopped 4 feet from her position. She looked at Stanton one final time. "Stay still," she said. "I'll be right here." She reached for the pack. The Barrett M82A1 weighs 30 pounds. Its .50 caliber round leaves the muzzle at approximately 2,700 feet per second and carries the energy of that velocity to distances that make most other weapons irrelevant. Its recoil against a shoulder that is not prepared for it has been described in training documentation as sufficient to cause clavicular fracture. Tessa pulled the rifle clear, unfolded the bipod in 2 movements that contained nothing unnecessary, went prone with the specific economy of someone for whom prone shooting is a native language. She made one adjustment to the elevation turret, a number she arrived at through the arithmetic that had been running in her background since she first identified the ridgeline range drop wind correction, the specific angular compensation that the elevation differential required. She found the position through the scope. The sniper on the ridgeline was capable, good enough to be nearly invisible, using the terrain with the competence of someone who had operated in this landscape for years. A fighting position that used the rock and shadow intelligently, that had been chosen for its angles of fire and its difficulty of observation. But at 820 meters, physics imposes requirements that cannot be entirely designed around. There are angles of cover that cannot be simultaneously maintained. Micro-movements that are invisible to most observation, but not to eyes that have been looking at targets at this distance for 15 years. A specific signature in the rock shadow that told her where the barrel was before she could see the barrel. She breathed in. 4 seconds. She held. 7 seconds. The contact was ongoing around her. She was aware of it, the team's weapons, the incoming from the valley floor, the radio traffic, the entirety of the situation. She was aware of all of it, and she placed it in its correct relationship to the specific geometry of this breath and this trigger and this distance, which was the thing that required her complete attention right now, and she gave it her complete attention. She exhaled slowly. She fired. The first round impacted 38 centimeters left of the targeted position. She saw it through the scope in the fraction of a second before the recoil took her off target. She worked the adjustment, a specific small correction that the first round had given her the data to make and reacquired. She controlled her heart rate through the technique her father had given her, which by this point in her life had moved entirely below the threshold of conscious effort. She fired the second round. The ridgeline went quiet. The quality of the silence that followed was different from the silence that had preceded it. The contact in the valley floor was still ongoing. The incoming from the secondary positions was still present, but the specific and methodical threat from the high ground to the east was gone, and the team's position without that angle of fire pressing them from above had enough room to work with. Tessa placed the Barrett down. She was back at Stanton in 4 seconds. His color was holding. His pulse was adequate, not strong but adequate. She checked the wound packing, adjusted the pressure along the medial margin, where the hemorrhage was trying to find a path around the tourniquet, looked at his face. "Still with me," she said. He looked at her. His eyes were focused. His mouth moved in the approximation of a response. She stayed with him. From across the position, through the managed noise of the continuing contact, she heard Kowalski's voice on the radio, controlled precise, giving the team the updated threat geometry now that the ridgeline position had been eliminated. She heard Briggs responding with the reorientation order that the change in geometry made possible. She heard the team beginning to move to use the window that had just been created to push back against the contact from a position of better options than they had had 30 seconds ago. She kept her hands on Stanton and her attention on his vital signs and her heart rate where it needed to be, which was where her father had taught her to keep it, which was where she had kept it through everything. The valley turned. The contact did not end. These things do not end in neat moments, but its character changed from a team managing a position that was becoming untenable to a team with the initiative beginning to shift back in their direction, and the shift was consequential. Briggs moved through the team's arc and reached Tessa's position. He looked at Stanton. He looked at Tessa's hands on Stanton's shoulder. He looked at the Barrett on the rock where she had placed it after the second shot. He did not say anything for a long moment. Then he said, "Who are you?" She looked up at him. She said, "I'm your medic, sir." It was accurate. It was complete. It was also the most carefully insufficient answer she could have given, and they both knew it. He held her gaze for a moment longer. Then he went back to managing the contact. Because there was still a contact to manage, and Tessa Wade was still doing her job, and the question of who she actually was going to have to wait for a different hour. The valley was cold, and the morning was bright, and the ridgeline to the east was quiet and 820 meters away. Something that had been a threat was not a threat anymore. Both hands. That was what it had taken. Both hands switching between the work they were built for and the work they had been given in the space of 4 seconds, without losing anything in the transition. The mountains above the valley registered none of this. They registered nothing. That was their nature. But something had happened in that valley on that morning that would not be undone. And the man who needed to understand it most was sitting in a building at Fort Bragg, waiting for a file that was about to make less sense than he expected, and then in the way that the best surprises work much more sense than anything else could. The contact ended at 0847, not with a definitive moment, not with a declared resolution or a single exchange that concluded things. It ended the way contacts end, when they have run their course with the incoming tapering to nothing, and the threat indicators going quiet, and the team's fire becoming first less necessary, and then unnecessary, and then absent, and the valley returning to the specific silence that follows violence, which is never quite the same as the silence that precedes it. The preceding silence is potential. The silence after is something that has been used. Briggs called stand down at 0851 after 3 minutes of confirmed no contact. The team went through the immediate aftermath procedures with the compressed efficiency of people who have done this enough times that the sequence is automatic personnel, check equipment, consolidation, threat, geometry assessment for secondary contact communication up the chain. The choreography of professionalism in a space that has just stopped being dangerous and might not have finished. Stanton was alive. Pale in significant pain that he was managing with the jaw-set discipline of a young soldier who understood that making noise about it served no one left arm. Not doing what his left arm was supposed to do, but alive, coherent, able to tell you his name and the current date and the answer to the question Briggs asked him about the name of his unit, which was the question Briggs asked every casualty as a rapid consciousness assessment in which Stanton answered without hesitation. Tessa had not left his side. She was listening to his chest with a cheap field stethoscope, functionally adequate, the kind of equipment that exists to do the job rather than to do it elegantly, moving it across his thorax in a sequence that was methodical in the way of someone who moves methodically because they are looking for something specific and have not yet decided whether they have found it. Then she went still. Not the stillness of a negative finding, the stillness of having found what she feared finding. She looked at Briggs. Tension pneumothorax, she said. Right side. Building. The words carried their clinical meaning efficiently and carried a deeper meaning underneath for anyone who understood what they represented in a body and in time. Air accumulating in the pleural space with no exit pathway, compressing the lung against the heart, progressing without any tendency towards self-correction. Left unaddressed, it moved through a predictable sequence, worsening respiratory distress, cardiovascular, compromised cardiac arrest. The timeline was not generous. The cause was the blast effect from the initial impact, the kind of secondary injury that arrives after the primary wound has absorbed all the attention, the kind that has killed more people than the wound that distracted from it. Kowalski was 6 feet away. He looked at Stanton and then at Tessa. He said, "What do you need?" She said, "Keep everyone back." She opened the kit. The 14-gauge angiocatheter was where it had been every time she had checked the inventory, which was multiple times since they had arrived in country, because she had the specific professional habit of knowing where every critical item was at all times in the way you know the position of things in a space you live in without looking, without searching, with the immediate certainty of familiarity. She found the landmark on Stanton's chest. Second intercostal space midclavicular line. She cleaned the site. She said to Stanton, "You'll feel pressure and then you'll hear something. Don't move." He didn't move. The needle went in. The sound that followed, brief, decisive, the hiss of trapped air finding the exit it had been denied, was disproportionately small for what it resolved. Stanton's next breath was visibly fuller than the breaths he had been taking for the previous 20 minutes. The gray that had been settling into his face began slowly to recede towards something more consistent with a person who was going to continue existing. Tessa secured the flutter valve, checked his pulse, checked his respiratory rate, looked at his eyes. "Better," she said. "Better," he said. She stayed with him. The team was quiet for a moment that was neither short nor long, but was specific, the moment in which multiple people are simultaneously processing what they have observed and arriving at conclusions that they do not yet have the language to share with each other. Kowalski looked at the Barrett on the rock. He looked at the ridgeline. He did the arithmetic because he was the kind of man who did arithmetic and expected it to produce reliable answers. And the answer this arithmetic produced was not one he had been carrying as a possibility 3 hours ago. He looked at Tessa, who was completely occupied by the patient in front of her and had not looked at the Barrett since she put it down. The arithmetic didn't leave room for the conclusions he had walked through the gate with on the first day. Briggs came to her when the medevac had been called and the LZ had been prepared and the team had settled into the patient watch that accompanies waiting. He came to her directly without the kind of preparation that announces itself. He said, "Where did you learn to shoot like that?" She was repacking the medical kit. Her hands moved through the inventory without requiring her eyes, and she spoke without looking up. "My father taught me," she said. Briggs waited for more. She did not add more. He said, "Your father was Navy." She said he was. The answer was technically accurate. It was also the kind of answer that is true in the way of a partial view, the part of the painting that is visible from a specific angle. Briggs recognized this immediately because he had been in enough conversations in which information was being carefully managed to recognize the quality of the management, and what he recognized here was not evasiveness, but something more, considered a person who had thought for a long time about what to share and had arrived at a position that she held consistently. He said, "What did he teach?" She closed the kit and looked at him directly. "Everything he could in the time he had," she said. The phrase had weight. The time he had. The past tense loaded with the specific gravity of a thing that ended rather than continuing. It landed in Briggs's hearing and stayed there in the way that significant things stay. He did not press. He left her to the patient. Collard had watched the exchange from 15 meters away. He watched it with the specific attention of a man who already possesses the answer to the question being asked and is observing the asking as a separate exercise. After Briggs moved away, Collard waited through the appropriate interval. Then he took out his communications device and composed a short message. It went to a number that was not in his official contacts list. It said in its entirety, "She's here, and she's exactly what you said she'd be." He sent it. He put the device away without looking at it again. The medevac came in at 11:20. Stanton and the team's second casualty, a fragmentation wound to the forearm that had been managed in the field, and required surgical follow-up rather than urgent intervention were loaded and lifted. The rotors made the sound they make and diminished northward, and then the valley was quiet again, in the way it had been before any of this started, which was to say not quite. The after-action review was efficient. Briggs went around the team, each man gave his assessment, the language was specific and professional, and stripped of the emotionality that would have been understandable given what had happened, but that this environment did not make room for. He got to Tessa last. She gave her medical assessment in the same register she used for everything else. The casualty presentations, the interventions, the timeline, the rationale for each decision. She cited the tension pneumothorax as the significant secondary finding and noted that the medevac crew had been fully briefed on the intervention history to date. She said there were no additional medical concerns within the team at present. She said all of this without editorial, without reference to anything that had happened before or after the medical work. Briggs said, "Good work." She accepted this in the way she accepted most things as information, rather than as something she needed. Kowalski was sitting across from her. He had been looking at his hands for most of the review. When Briggs dismissed the team, he looked up at her. He started to say something. She was already standing, already moving toward her equipment. He let it go. He filed the debt. He would pay it at a better moment. That night, Briggs opened his laptop. He was a patient man when the situation required it, and this situation required it. He spent 2 hours on the research, moving through the accessible records first, and then into the layers that required additional access credentials that his role provided, and he followed the thread carefully because careful following was how you got to the end of threads rather than the middle. The name he started with was Wade, Navy. The specific phrasing she had used, the time he had, the weight of it. What he found was not everything. It was not close to everything. It was enough. Chief Warrant Officer Daniel Wade, Naval Special Warfare Development Group, service spanning 21 years. Deployments listed by region rather than country in the unclassified record, which was its own form of information. Decorations that included 2 awards that most people in the Naval Special Warfare community encountered once, if at all in a full career. An operational call sign that appeared in the records in the manner of a word that people use carefully because they understand its weight. The Ghost. KIA Afghanistan. March 2011. Survived by 1 child, a daughter. Briggs sat with the laptop open and the screen casting a rectangle of pale light in the dark room. He thought about the 72 hours, the map exercise and the elevation figures she had corrected without looking at the data, the knee that the previous medic would have missed, the farmer's femoral artery and the 90 seconds that had saved his life, the Barrett in the 2 rounds in the 820 meters and the way she had set the rifle down and gone back to the patient in 4 seconds. He thought about the evaluation file, unsettlingly calm under conditions that would justify the alternative. He thought about the phrase everything he could in the time he had, and about the specific weight that the time he had carried, and about what it meant that a man like Daniel Wade had had 2 years to give his daughter what he gave her before the time was gone. He thought about what it cost a person to carry a name like that without using it, to walk into a room full of men who were measuring her and to refuse deliberately and consistently to produce the credential that would have changed every measurement in the room, to have chosen to be assessed on what she could do with her own hands without the biography attached. He thought about what kind of person makes that choice and keeps it for years. He closed the laptop. He went to check the watch rotation. She was outside, the same position she took every night when she needed to be outside, back against the north wall facing into the open ground, reading the terrain with the automatic thoroughness of someone for whom reading terrain was not a practice, but a state. Briggs stood at the corner of the building and looked at her and thought about the file, and thought about the note in the evaluation, and thought about who specifically he was looking at. He went inside and left her to the dark in the mountains, and whatever she was working through in the privacy of the space she created for herself in the hours that weren't required for anything else. She had the letter in her hands. Not open. She had not opened it. She had been carrying it for 13 years in the most protected place available, in whatever bag or pack or drawer was currently her most permanent address, and she had carried it into this mission in a specific way. Before leaving the forward base for the undercover approach to the physician, she had packed the cover kit medical bag, documentation, the Glock in the interior compartment, and at the end of the inventory, she had stood with the packed bag in her hands for a moment. Then she had opened it again and placed the envelope at the bottom below everything else in the small internal pocket that nothing operational required. She had not examined this decision when she made it. It was not new. She had carried the envelope into every deployment since she was 18. Not from sentiment alone, but from the same instinct that drives certain operators to carry things into the field that have no tactical function, but that are connected to the specific reason the work matters. The letter was not a comfort exactly. It was a compass. It pointed at something even sealed, even unread. And she had learned over years of carrying it that a compass does not need to be consulted to function. The needle moves whether you look at it or not. She picked up the bag and left. The letter was in the envelope. The envelope was in the sealed place at the bottom of the bag. And she was carrying it into a situation where the bag might end up in other hands because she had done the calculation and determined that the risk was acceptable given what the mission required and what she was prepared to do to complete it. Now sitting in the dark against the wall with the envelope in her hands, she traced the block letters of her name with one finger. Her father's handwriting, Tessa. The specific quality of a man's hand that had spent decades writing things that needed to be read quickly and correctly under adverse conditions. She had known about the letter since the week after he died. Her mother had handed it to her from the box of personal effects, no explanation, because no explanation was necessary, and her mother had always understood which silences were explanations. Tessa had put it away and had not opened it, not because she was refusing anything, but because she was not ready, and she had the self-knowledge to understand the difference between readiness and its absence. She was not sure what she was afraid to find. That was the less honest version. The more honest version was that she was afraid of two opposite things, and their opposition was the trap. She was afraid that it would contain something that made her feel she had been doing the wrong things with the life he had given her. And she was afraid that it would contain something that confirmed she had been doing exactly the right things and that the confirmation would carry a weight she didn't know if she could hold. Both fears were real. The envelope stayed sealed. She put it back in the pack. She looked at the mountains. She breathed in the deliberate way he had taught her, not the 4-7-8 technique specifically that was one tool among many he had given her, but the broader practice of using the breath as an anchor when everything else was moving. The breath as the fixed point that the rest of the situation could be organized around. Then she went back to the work. The third week brought a different kind of operation. The after-action intelligence from the Valley contact had produced a secondary product material recovered from the ridgeline position after the sniper had been neutralized that revealed a network larger and more organized than the initial operational framing had indicated. More nodes, more material, more reach in both directions than the pre-deployment assessment had mapped. Briggs received updated tasking. The mandate expanded. Part of the expansion involved cultivating a specific intelligence source, a physician with connections across multiple villages in the surrounding valleys, who had information about the network's movement patterns that conventional intelligence channels had not been able to access. The source had communicated through an intermediary a willingness to meet. The intermediary had specified a constraint: the source would not meet with anyone who read on site as military. He would meet with someone who could plausibly occupy the civilian register, a medical professional, NGO adjacent operating without the signature of the institutional presence he had reason to distrust. Briggs reviewed the parameters and the team's personnel. He knew the answer before he finished the review. He called Tessa in. She listened to the operational parameters. She asked 2 questions in sequence: the reliability rating of the intermediary and the exfil window if the situation changed before she reached the source. Both were the right questions in the order that the operational logic required. She said she would do it. Briggs said he needed to think about it. She said, "Sir, this is what I'm here for." He looked at her for a long moment. He thought about Daniel Wade's file, about the note in her evaluation, about everything he had been collecting since the first morning and what it assembled into. He said, "Cover kit and a low-profile sidearm. You reach the source, collect the intelligence, and you are back at the exfil point within 3 hours. If anything reads wrong before you reach him, you abort without question." She said, "Understood." He said, "Tessa." She stopped. He said, "Your father was a serious man." She held his gaze. "I know," she said. She left. The village was 4 kilometers from the team's position on a track that the landscape had produced through accumulated use rather than deliberate engineering. Compacted earth, receding vegetation on both sides, technically a road in the way that a path followed long enough becomes a road. She traveled it in the late morning in clothing appropriate to the cover, carrying the medical bag that was exactly what it appeared to be from the outside. The village held 40 or 50 families organized in the pattern common to this part of the province, compounds turned inward, high outer walls. The outside world kept at the specific distance that generations of experience with the outside world had established as appropriate. She was noticed when she entered. She was always noticed in places like this. She met each set of eyes briefly without challenge, without performance, and kept moving. The intermediary was at the edge of the market, a man in his 40s managing his anxiety through deliberate physical slowness. He greeted her in Dari. She responded with the functional competence she had built through 2 years of study and one deployment in a region where the language was adjacent enough to be useful. He led her through 2 alleys and into a compound. The physician was older than the briefing had suggested. 70 at minimum, sitting in a low chair, in a room with the smell of wood smoke and the quality of stillness that comes from a space used for thinking. He looked at her with the evaluation of a man who had assessed a great many people under a great many circumstances and had developed precise instruments for the work. He spoke in Dari. The intermediary translated. He had information, he said. He was providing it because the people it concerned had killed his son, and he wanted the providing to matter. He had been waiting for someone who could do something with it. She listened. The intelligence was specific movement routes, timing personnel, counts, the identity of 2 transit points within the next 72 hours. When passed up the chain, it would give the team's operational picture a clarity that 3 weeks of reconnaissance had not produced. She thanked him and meant it. She received the information with the specific discipline of a person trained to hold significant data without changing their outward presentation, and she held it as she left the compound and began the route back toward the exfil point. She had been running a surveillance detection route from the moment she entered the village. It was not a technique she applied consciously any longer. It had moved past technique into the category of continuous background processing, the way pattern recognition in a visual field operates below the threshold of deliberate attention. She saw it at the second intersection after the market. 2 men, different directions, which was the discipline, the trained separation of a surveillance pair to avoid the obvious pairing. But they were matching her pace adjustments in a way that was inconsistent with independent movement. One had footwear too uniform for a village market, the specific uniformity of equipment that comes from a common source. Neither had the relaxed, unfocused peripheral attention of a person simply passing through a space they inhabited. She counted what was visible. She estimated what wasn't. The geometry of the alley system was narrowing her options faster than the distance to the exfil point could accommodate. The Glock was available, but drawing in the middle of a civilian market with unquantified additional personnel would produce an outcome she couldn't control. The communications window for calling in support required time she didn't have in the quantities that the support would require to be actionable. She ran the calculation. The physician's intelligence was already gone. She had transmitted the compressed package from her communications device. In the 30 seconds she had been alone in the alley behind the compound, the window between leaving the physician and meeting the intermediary for the route back. Her father had told her once that information delayed for comfort is information risked for pride. She had taken it as an operating principle at 16 and had never found a situation where it wasn't true. The intelligence was out of her hands and into the network. She stopped at the entrance to the alley. She set the medical bag down. She raised her hands. They did not produce immediate violence. This was information. People who intend immediate harm do not transport. They blindfolded her, put her in a vehicle, and drove for what her internal navigation estimated at 25 to 35 minutes north-northeast, with sustained climbing, which placed them in the higher ground above the valley floor where the team's observation capability was limited by the terrain. They took the Glock. They took the communications device already cleared of everything except cover documentation. They searched the bag and found what the cover contained. The blindfold came off in a stone room that smelled of damp and wood smoke, and the specific combination of those 2 things that old mountain structures accumulate over generations of use. 2 guards. A third person arrived 20 minutes later, the person who would be asking questions. His English was functional. His accent was not local. She filed this without indicating she had filed it. He said, "Tell me who you work for." She looked at him and said nothing. He said, "Your documents identify you as a medical worker. Medical workers in this region operate through 3 organizations. We have contacts in 2. You are not in either system." She said nothing. He said, "The physician you met with is known to us. What did he tell you?" She said nothing. He studied her face the way an experienced interrogator studies a face, looking not for reaction, but for the absence of reaction, which is itself a category of information. She gave him the absence without effort. There was nothing performing the absence. The stillness was simply there, the way it had always been there, the way her father had said it was there before he had done anything to put it there. He left. They brought her outside at 0300. The cold was immediate and total. 14 degrees with a wind from the north that moved across the mountain face with the thoroughness of a physical process that has no awareness of what it is moving across. She was not given additional clothing. The tree was at the edge of the clearing, a pine old wide enough that she could not have circled it with her arms. The wire they used was cargo wire, not rope, not restraint wire designed for human use, but the thick steel wire used to secure loads in transit, and it communicated through its use a specific quality of indifference to the cost of the communication. They bound her wrists and left her suspended feet off the ground in the dark and the cold. For the first hour, she organized her body. This was the framework her father had given her at 16 on a Saturday morning in the backyard of the house in Virginia when she had asked him what happened if someone caught you. He had told her without abstraction, in the specific and practical way he told her everything that mattered. He had walked her through the physiology of sustained stress positions, the management and strategies that prolonged functional capacity, the mental framework that prevented the catastrophizing that accelerated physiological decline. He had done this not to frighten her, but to give her tools for a situation that he understood was possible and that he had decided she should be equipped for rather than protected from. She contracted her core, transferred as much weight as she could from the shoulder joints to the broader muscle groups, initiated the isometric sequence systematic contraction of each muscle group for 10 seconds released, moved to the next working from her feet upward to generate internal heat against the cold that was entering her from every surface simultaneously. She counted the interval between wind gusts. She counted the steps in the guard rotation. She counted the sound pattern from the structure behind her voices. Movement radio traffic, the rhythm of people managing a night they had not designed for enjoyment. All information, all potentially useful. The interrogator came back at intervals. He varied the approach, sometimes direct questioning, sometimes the kind of ambient pressure that is meant to erode rather than extract sometimes silence. She gave him the same thing each time. She gave him the stillness that was not performance and was not suppression and was simply the nature that she had been born with and had spent 15 years understanding. At the 7th hour, when the cold had moved from discomfort into the systemic territory where the body begins making decisions about resource allocation that a person does not get to vote on, she shifted her focus. Her father had told her the body can sustain almost anything if the mind does not give it permission to stop. The mind stops when it runs out of reasons to continue. So you maintain the reasons. You hold them in front of you the way you hold a compass. You know what you're pointing at. She held the reasons. Stanton, who needed the team to remain operational to have the best possible extraction. The physician's intelligence, which was already in the network and which would produce results only if the team was still functional when those results became actionable. The mission that extended beyond this clearing, beyond this tree, beyond this night. She held these reasons with the same steady hands she held everything. At the 15th hour, the interrogator tried something different. He had given up on direct questions. He understood by now that direct questions would not produce what he was looking for. He was moving to the environment, not the physical environment, which he had already deployed, but the personal one. He said things about the team she had come from, about the duration of any organized search before it became unrealistic about the outcomes that followed from that duration. She listened. She gave him nothing. Then he reached into the medical bag that one of the guards had been carrying since they arrived. She had not been thinking about the bag. The bag contained equipment and cover documentation and nothing that deviated from the cover in any way that mattered operationally, which was why she had not been concerned about it. He reached to the bottom of the bag, to the internal pocket, and he produced the envelope. She saw her name in her father's handwriting, Tessa. The block letters, the compressed, deliberate quality of a hand that had written for legibility rather than expression for most of its adult life. He held it up into the flashlight. He was watching her face. Something moved in her face. She knew it moved because she could not entirely prevent it. Not a full reaction. Nothing that an untrained observer would necessarily have read as significant, but in the specific minimal movement of the muscles around her eyes that an experienced interrogator reading a face he has been watching for 15 hours would find. The involuntary signal of recognition and loss arriving simultaneously. He saw it. Of course he saw it. He had been waiting for something exactly like it. He said, "This is important to you." He produced a lighter. He held the flame near the corner of the envelope. She looked at the envelope. She looked at her father's handwriting. She looked at the flame. She looked back at him. She gave him nothing. And she thought in the specific clarity of exhaustion past its own threshold, he can burn it. He can take the last physical thing her father wrote for her and reduce it to ash in the cold wind of this mountain. He has that power. She cannot stop him. He does not have the other thing. The meaning of the letter was not in the paper. She had understood this for years, but had not fully believed it until this moment. The meaning was somewhere that fire could not reach in the 13 years of carrying it without reading it, which was its own conversation, its own continuous exchange with a man who couldn't respond. In everything she had done with the life he had given her, and the abilities he had passed to her, and the values he had built into the structure of how she saw the world and what she understood her obligation in it to be. She already knew what the letter said, not the specific words. Those were in the envelope. But the essential thing, the thing that a man like her father would have needed his daughter to know, she had known it for years. She had known it in the way you know things that are true about a person you love and have watched carefully and have never stopped paying attention to. She knew it in the way the work she had done for the past 7 years was an expression of it, in the way she had honored his absence by becoming something worthy of the presence he had been. He was proud of her, not of what she could do with a rifle or a medical kit, of who she was, of the stillness, of the patience, of the refusal to let the hard things make her into a harder version of herself than the situation actually required. She knew. The paper was paper. She looked at the man holding the flame near her father's handwriting, and she held his gaze and she gave him nothing. He held the flame for 30 seconds. Then he withdrew it. He put the envelope in his own jacket pocket. He said something to the guards and walked back toward the structure, and the door closed, and she was alone again, in the cold and the dark, with the tree and the wire, and the mountains that were beginning at last to release the night. She returned to the breath. Not the technique specifically, but the practice beneath the technique, using the breath as the anchor, as the fixed point that the rest of the situation could be organized around. The specific quiet discipline of a person who has been given a way of remaining in the present moment, regardless of what the present moment contains. She held, she counted, she waited. At the 15th hour, something changed in the pattern of the compound's activity. Not in her and the behavioral signatures she had been reading throughout. An increase in movement, a change in the quality of the communication traffic. The specific behavioral shift of people who are responding to an external development rather than the internal routine they have been maintaining. Something was coming. She did not know what. She kept her heart rate where it needed to be. She organized her body against the cold with the tools she had. She held her reasons in front of her, and she waited. They came in at 0611. She heard it before she saw it, the sound of a compound being cleared by professionals who had done this specific sequence often enough that it had acquired the quality of practice choreography. Brief, controlled, decisive. The communication in the tactical channel was minimal because the team executing it had reached the point where the work itself was the communication. The shooting was contained and purposeful and over in under 4 minutes. Different footsteps, different voices, a blade at the wire above her wrists. She came down. She could not have stood unassisted. This was not a failure of will. It was the accurate physical accounting of what 19 hours of suspension and 14-degree cold had done to the specific muscle groups and joint structures responsible for standing. She acknowledged this without judgment and accepted the support of the hands that caught her with the same practical clarity she brought to any medical assessment. The face that resolved through the blur of the first moments was young. Mid-20s, methodical in the way of a trained medic beginning an assessment, managing whatever his initial reaction was with the professional competence his training had built. Prescott, not part of Briggs's team. He was with the extraction element, a different unit brought in for the recovery operation. His kit identified him as a Navy corpsman. She registered all of this in the first 5 seconds. She registered something else in the next 2 seconds. The team leader of the extraction element, standing 8 meters away on a radio call, his back partially turned. She said in a voice roughened by cold and 19 hours of silence barely audible, "Don't let him see what's under my left sleeve." Prescott looked at her. He looked at the team leader. He looked back at her. She had already closed her eyes. He worked fast. Speed was the clinical imperative, and the situation reinforced it. He started with the wrists as the injury presentation required cutting away the remnants of wire and assessing what remained. The lacerations were significant. The pattern was informative. The specific wound profile of wire applied under body weight for an extended period, which told him before anyone said anything, approximately how long she had been here. He cleaned and pressed. He checked circulation distal to the injury. He checked capillary refill. Then he needed to properly assess the left wrist. He pushed the sleeve up. He saw the tattoo. It was small, placed on the inner surface of the forearm, positioned exactly where a sleeve would cover it in every professional context. The decision to put it there had been deliberate and old. The ink had the settled quality of something placed years ago, absorbed and integrated into the skin around it. The seal trident, precisely proportioned, correctly rendered, without the embellishment that decorative versions typically carry. He had seen versions of the trident before in this community you encountered them. He had never seen what was beneath it. Below the trident, in precise block characters, a designation code. Prescott looked at it, his hand stopped. In 6 years of Navy medicine in situations ranging from training accidents to active firefights, he had developed the professional capacity to continue working in the presence of significant findings, to treat the wound and process the implications afterward in the space that follows, rather than the space of the work itself. He sat back on his heels. The designation code was specific. He recognized it not from a roster, no roster would have contained it, but from a classified orientation document that a senior instructor had placed in front of him during his first week of assignment to the Naval Special Warfare Support Element, and then removed after 15 minutes, saying only that what was in it represented a standard that the community did not discuss openly because the standard existed above the level at which discussion was productive. He had read that document in the way he read everything, with full attention and complete retention. The code on her arm matched the code in that document. He looked at it again. He looked at her face, unconscious now, the composure released into the blankness of a body that had spent everything it had. He looked at her size, her proportions, the 118 pounds that had just endured what 19 hours of wire and cold and 14 degrees produced. He stood up and walked to the edge of the position. He looked at the eastern ridge, 820 meters approximately, the distance from this position to the point where the sniper threat had been eliminated. He did the range estimation with the practiced ease of someone for whom range estimation was a trained reflex, confirmed his number against the terrain features, and held it. Then he thought about the briefing he had received before the extraction. The brief had been sparse: a recovery operation, a female corpsman with unknown injuries, a compromised position. One detail in the brief, delivered with the casual precision of someone repeating a fact they considered notable: the sniper who had been pinning the original team was eliminated by one of the team's own personnel. Range estimated at 800 to 850 meters. He thought about that detail in relation to the designation code on her arm. He thought about the call sign in the orientation document, the word the document had used to describe the operational record, the specific and restrained language of institutional reverence that is different from praise in the way that great distances are different from large ones. The ghost. He went back to her. He rolled her sleeve down with the same care he had used to push it up. He finished the assessment systematically. Temperature, blood pressure, the rib fractures he found on palpation, the secondary hypothermia indicators. He prepared the IV line and the evacuation summary. He did all of this with steady hands. When the team leader came over and asked for the casualty status, Prescott gave the clinical summary: temperature, blood pressure, injuries, interventions, prognosis. He gave it fully and accurately and without editorializing. The team leader listened. Then he said, "Anything else?" Prescott met his eyes. He said, "Check the inner left forearm when you get a moment." The team leader looked at him with the evaluative attention of a man who has been doing this long enough to know when someone is telling him something oblique rather than direct, and to understand that the obliqueness has a reason. He said, "What will I find?" Prescott looked at her one more time. At the 118 pounds that had spent 19 hours on a tree in 14 degrees and had not given anyone a single word. At the hands that had built a nest into the rock to fire a Barrett at 820 meters and had set the rifle down 4 seconds later to go back to a patient. He said, "You'll find the reason this operation was not optional." The team leader looked at him for a long moment. Then he went to look. The mountains above were entering the light of morning in the specific way they enter it, reluctantly, the high peaks holding the dark, while the valleys below filled with the first pale light of a day that had been a long time arriving. The clearing was quiet, the compound was secured, and on the ground, in the space between the tree and the edge of the position, a woman with steel wire marks on her wrists and frost in her hair was breathing with the steady, even quality of a person who has made a decision that the body is going to continue, and the body has accepted the decision, and everything that comes next will be addressed when it arrives. The designation on her arm read "The Ghost Generation 2." And the man who had just read it stood with his back to the clearing for a long time, looking at the eastern ridge and the distance it represented, and said nothing because there was nothing that the language he had available could do justice to. She woke asking about Stanton. Not gradually, not with the disorientation that typically accompanies the return of consciousness after the body has spent everything it has and been forcibly returned to warmth. She came back the way she did most things, from wherever she had been, to fully present in the space of a single breath, without the confused interval in between. The first coherent thing out of her mouth was his name. Prescott was monitoring her from the seat across the transport interior, clipboard in hand, watching the vitals display with the divided attention of a medic managing a patient who is stable but recently was not. He looked up. "Stanton is stable," he said. "He's at the forward surgical element at Bagram. They repaired the shoulder. He'll keep the arm." She absorbed this. She looked at the ceiling of the transport for a moment in a way that was the only external indication of what she had been holding. Then she said, "How long was I out?" 4 hours and 17 minutes. She sat up. He said, "You should stay down." She was already conducting her own assessment: temperature, peripheral sensation, grip, strength, the specific inventory of a person evaluating their own functional status against the requirements of the immediate situation. The IV had done its work. The ribs communicated their presence with the specific localized language of fractures as distinct from the diffuse report of internal injury. Her hands opened and closed with complete function. She said, "I'm fine." Prescott looked at her with 6 years of experience at reading those two words in every register of accuracy and inaccuracy. She was fine. Not because nothing had happened, because whatever had happened had been absorbed into the structure of who she was rather than standing in opposition to it. He had not seen this quality before in this form. He had seen resilience in many variations. This was something more specific than resilience. It was a quality of integration, the way certain materials absorb impact rather than fracturing under it. He did not push back on her sitting up. They landed at the forward base in the late afternoon, the mountains to the east going dark at the peaks, while the valley still held the last of the day. Briggs was at the edge of the landing zone. He watched her come off the transport. Moving carefully, the ribs required it, but on her own, carrying her own kit, the bandages on her wrists visible below her sleeves, and the bruising along her temple in full development. Now, after the hours since injury, he fell into step beside her. He said, "Medical assessment says 48 hours minimum before operational activity." She said, "Understood." He said, 48 hours, Tessa, not 36. She looked at him. The use of her given name, not her rank, not Wade, not Doc, which the team had arrived at with the organic precision that teams use to incorporate a person, had a specific quality. It addressed the whole person rather than the function. She said, "Yes, sir." They walked toward the main building. He said without looking at her, "Your father would have walked off a transport like that and tried to be operational inside of 4 hours. She said he would have made it in 2. Something in his expression moved in the direction of something that was not quite a smile, but was in the territory adjacent to it. They went inside. The debrief waited for the following morning after she had slept 6 consecutive hours in an actual bunk, and the base surgeon had reviewed Prescott's field assessment. The surgeon confirmed the rib fractures recleaned and resutured the left wrist, 4 additional stitches where the field dressing had managed but not fully resolved, and confirmed the hypothermia had cleared without sequela. He said, "You were fortunate." She had a considered view on the role of fortune in outcomes which her father had formed in her, and which held that fortune occupied the spaces that preparation could not reach, and that the ratio of those two things was actively influenceable. She did not share this view with the surgeon because it was not what the conversation required. She said, "Thank you." She went to the debrief. The debrief was Briggs Callard and an intelligence representative who had coordinated the extraction operation. The questions were specific, and she answered each one with the precision it required. She had transmitted the package before capture confirmed. The package had been received confirmed. The intelligence product from the physician was being processed, and the initial assessment indicated significant operational value. She received this confirmation without visible response. At the end of the formal debrief, the intelligence representative left. Callard stayed. He looked at Briggs. He looked at Tessa. He reached into the kit bag he had brought with him and placed an envelope on the table between them. She looked at it. Her father's handwriting. Her name. The seal intact. The room was quiet in the specific way of a room where something significant has just arrived, and everyone present understands that the significance requires a particular kind of space. She looked at Callard. He said it was on the 3rd person we detained in the compound. In her jacket pocket. She looked at the envelope. She had been carrying it for 13 years without opening it. A man she had never met had carried it for 19 hours. Now it was on a table in front of her, in a room in Afghanistan, and the question it represented was still there. still sealed, still waiting for the readiness she had been building toward for more than a decade. She picked it up. She turned it over once. She looked at Briggs. He said, "We'll be outside." He and Callard left without ceremony. The door closed. She sat alone in the room with the envelope for a long moment. She thought about the man who had held it above a flame. She thought about what she had thought in that moment, that the paper was paper, that the meaning was somewhere else, somewhere fire couldn't reach. She had believed it in the tree. She still believed it. But her hands were already opening the envelope. The letter was 2 pages written in the deliberate block script of a man who had spent most of his adult life writing things that needed to be read correctly on the first attempt. She read it once, then read it again more slowly in the specific quiet of a room where the only sound was the distant background of a bass that never fully stops. He had written it before the last deployment, as he had written a letter before every deployment since she was born. The same practice, the same place in the house where her mother would know to find it, the same acknowledgement that what he was preparing to do contained as a permanent possibility, the outcome that the packaging of his personal effects would communicate. He had written knowing she might be 12 when she read it. He had written knowing she might be 40. He wrote about what he had been trying to give her when he put a rifle in her hands at 10 years old. Not the skill itself, not the mechanics of long-range shooting, not the technique. He had been trying to give her steadiness, the ability to be entirely in the real moment rather than the anticipated one. He had watched other people try to teach this quality and had concluded over 20 years that it could not be taught directly, it could only be recognized when it appeared and not interfered with. He had seen it in her before he began. He had been afraid of it at first, he wrote, afraid that he was asking something of a child that grown professionals spent careers trying to develop. But he had watched her over those 2 years and understood that the steadiness was not a burden she was carrying. It was simply who she was. The training had not created it. The training had given it a language. He wrote about the letter. He said he knew she would carry it and not open it for a long time, and that this was correct, and that when she opened it, she would discover that she already knew everything in it. He wrote that is also correct. He wrote about her mother and the promise he was certain she would ask for, and his belief that honoring it was the right thing to do. He wrote that there would come a moment when the honoring of it would cost something real, and that the cost would be the price of being who she was, and he was not asking her to pay it for his memory. He was asking her to pay it for herself and for the people standing next to her when the moment arrived. The last paragraph was short. He wrote, "I have been in rooms with remarkable people and in the field with people who gave everything they had for the person next to them. What I know with more certainty than almost anything else is that the quality that makes a person worth standing next to has nothing to do with what they can do. It has everything to do with what they choose when the choice is real and the cost is real. I know what you will choose. I have always known. And that is why I don't worry about you. Not because the world isn't dangerous, because you are already everything it requires." He did not sign it with his rank or his call sign. He signed it Dad. She sat with the letter after she had finished reading it in the quiet of the room, the 2 pages in her hands and the specific weight of 13 years settling into something that was neither heavier nor lighter, but was resolved. Not closed things like this do not close, but resolved in the way a question becomes unnecessary when the answer has been growing in you for so long that the formal asking of it is a formality. She had known. She folded the letter. She put it back in the envelope. She put the envelope in the inside pocket of her jacket against her chest. She stood up and went to find Briggs. Kowalski found her first. He was in the corridor outside the debrief room, which was not accidental. She recognized this, immediately recognized it in the positioning and in the fact that his arms were at his sides rather than crossed, which was a posture she had not seen on him in any context that was not active work. He said her name, her given name, not Doc, not Wade. She stopped. He looked at the floor and then at her in the way of a man who has said a thing in his head many times and is discovering that the version he arrives at out loud is different from any of the rehearsed versions. He said, "I was wrong about you from the first day. I made up my mind before I had any information to base it on, and I held that longer than I should have. That's not professional and it's not fair, and I know it." She looked at him. He said, "I'm not asking you to say it doesn't matter. It does matter. I'm telling you, I know it does." The corridor was quiet. Somewhere down the hall, a radio was running through a comms check. The bass had its rhythms and its background, and inside all of that was this 2 people in a corridor, one of them saying a thing that cost him something, the other one deciding what to do with it. She said, "I know, you know it." He nodded. She said, "We're good, Kowalski." She said it the way you say something when the accounting has been settled rather than deferred. And he heard the difference, and something in his posture changed, not theatrically, not in the way of a performance of relief, but in the specific small physical way of a man whose shoulders have been carrying something that has just been put down. He said, "Yeah, we're good." She walked past him. He watched her go. The 48 hours passed. She spent them the way she spent recovery time when recovery was clinically indicated, and she had no choice about it as efficiently as the process permitted. She ate in the quantities that the body required for actual recovery rather than the quantities that a compressed operational schedule allows. She slept in full stretches. She worked through the physical rehabilitation sequence that Prescott had outlined for the shoulder mobility issues that the suspension had created with the same methodical commitment she brought to everything. On the second morning, she went to find Prescott. He was in the small medical station at the east end of the compound, going through his equipment inventory with the focused attention of someone who takes care of things. He looked up when she came in. She said the field work was good. The needle decompression protocol was clean. He said, "You told me not to let him see your sleeve." She said, "I know." He said, "That was your first coherent sentence." After 19 hours on a tree, she said it wasn't about the cover. He looked at her and she explained what she had told herself in the moment, that the designation code was information about the team and the operation and the people whose work it could complicate, and that information needed protection the same as anything else that needed protection. He thought about this for a moment. He said, "Can I ask you something?" She said, "You can ask." He said, "The designation, the transfer. How long have you known about it?" She said, 4 years, a retired officer who knew my father told me. He said it had been transferred into a classified record about 6 months after my father was killed. He thought I should know. He said, "Did you know what it meant?" She said, "I knew what my father meant it to mean when he carried it. He carried his designation as a commitment, not as a record of what he had done, but as a statement of what he was trying to be. I put it on my arm because I was making the same commitment, not to match him, to continue the direction he pointed me in." She said this without the weight of performance. She said it the way she said things that were simply true, flatly accurately, without making them larger than they were. Prescott said nothing for a time. Then he said, "The file for that designation, when I read it in orientation, it was one of maybe 4 documents I encountered in 6 years that I read twice. The second time not for information, but because I wasn't sure I had understood the scale of it correctly the first time." She waited. He said, "I want you to know that whatever the institutional process produces, whatever timeline it runs on the people who matter in this community, already understand what they're looking at." She looked at him. She said, "Thank you." She left. The 48 hours ended and the team assembled for a brief. Briggs entered with the compressed, purposeful economy of a man who has something to communicate and intends to communicate it efficiently. He briefed the updated intelligence picture. The physician's information combined with the intercept product from the Valley contact 3 weeks prior had produced a specific and actionable picture of the network's next significant movement. There was a window. The window was narrow. The team needed to move within 18 hours. He went through the route, the objective, the personnel assignments. He assigned Tessa to the primary element. He did this without elaboration. It was a statement of operational logic rather than a gesture, and the team read it as such. Kowalski looked at Briggs, confirming rather than questioning. Callard showed nothing. Tessa looked at the map. They moved out at 0200. The route was 28 kilometers through terrain that the maps described accurately and incompletely accurately, because the measurements were correct, incompletely, because maps cannot communicate the specific quality of mountain ground underfoot in the dark, or the way cold accumulates in the body over 4 hours of sustained movement at altitude, or the particular fatigue profile of a set of ribs that have been fractured and are healing and are now being asked to participate in something that healing ribs do not prefer. She moved through all of it. The ribs were present in every steep section, every scramble over broken rock, every moment where the pack shifted and the strapping pulled against the fracture sites. She incorporated this into her movement pattern without letting it change her pace or her position in the file. The shoulder mobility was not fully restored, but was within the functional range that the mission required. She had assessed herself against the mission requirements the evening before with clinical objectivity and had determined that she was fit for purpose. She was fit for purpose. The team reached the objective position 90 minutes before the intelligence window opened, established in the rocky outcropping above a secondary road that was the network's most probable transit road. Briggs placed the security arc. Callard set communications. Stanton's replacement on the primary observation took the elevated position. Tessa placed the medical kit. She settled in. She waited. The window opened at 0537. Nothing happened. At 0611, a vehicle appeared at the western end of the road below. At 0614, it was confirmed as consistent with the network profile. At 0619, it stopped 300 meters short of the team's optimal position. Briggs watched through his optics. He said, "Something's wrong." She was already reading it. Not through optics, but through the vehicle's behavior, the way it had stopped in a position that was tactically inexplicable for innocent transit, but precisely explicable for a vehicle serving as a probe checking for the kind of observation position the team was currently occupying. Secondary vehicles appeared, two from different approaches. The geometry shifted from an ambush the team was setting to an ambush the team was in. Briggs called contact at 0621. Three vehicles, multiple personnel approach vectors covering the primary exfil and most of the secondary. The team's position in the rocky outcropping was defensible for a short interval and would not remain so. Briggs worked the situation with the focused calm of a man who has been in situations that were worse and who understands that the correct response to a bad position is not to wish for a different one, but to work with what the position provides. Kowalski covered the right flank. Two others managed the southern approach. Collard was on the radio calling the contact up the chain and requesting the quick reaction force support that would arrive in a time frame that was longer than the immediate situation preferred. Tessa was at the center of the position, kit open ready. At 0628, the situation changed, not from incoming fire, from inside the team's own position. A team member named Garrett, 29 years old, 2 years with the unit, steady and capable in every operation she had observed him in, was covering a gap in the security arc on the north side when the ground gave way beneath him. Not an ambush, not a device, a natural failure, a section of rock shelf that had been stable for years and was not stable under his specific weight and angle. He dropped 4 meters onto the ground below the outcropping in a section of the position that was exposed to the southern approach, where one of the network vehicles had deployed its personnel. His voice came over the radio immediately. Controlled clear, the specific controlled quality of a trained soldier reporting an injury rather than expressing it. He said, "Down. I cannot feel my legs." She was moving before the last word. Kowalski would describe this later in the specific undramatic way he described things as something he was watching from 3 meters away in real time, and that he could not break into a sequence of decisions because there had been no sequence. He would say, "She heard him and she was over the edge of that outcropping inside of 2 seconds, and I don't think the decision part happened at all. I think she was already in motion before the thinking part had anything to say about it. She went over the edge. She reached Garrett on the lower shelf. The mechanism of injury was clear. The clinical picture was spinal shock from the impact, transient or structural, impossible to differentiate in the field without imaging. No way to know whether the paralysis was temporary, the nervous system recovering from a sudden insult, or permanent, the kind of damage that stays. What she could know was the protocol immobilized, manage the airway, manage the secondary injuries, maintain the patient's condition until the imaging could answer the question she couldn't answer. She talked to him in the specific voice, not comfort, not minimization, but presence. The presence of someone who is fully in the situation and is managing it. She said, "I'm here. Stay still for me. I've got you." He stayed still. She heard incoming. The personnel from the southern vehicle had identified her position. The lower shelf was exposed in exactly the way she had understood it was exposed when she went over the edge, and she had gone over the edge anyway because Garrett was there and he needed her there, and those were the terms. Rounds impacted the rock face behind her. Close. She placed her body between the incoming and the patient and continued the assessment. The immobilization, the management of the secondary injuries, a right radius fracture, visible requiring splinting, a scalp laceration bleeding with the aggressive enthusiasm that scalp lacerations have, regardless of their depth. She worked. The incoming stopped. From above her, from the position she had come down from, she heard the specific sound of a Barrett M82A1 being fired. 1 round. Clean. The southern position went quiet. She did not look up. She kept her hands on Garrett and her attention on his vital signs. She registered what had happened without looking at it. A threat to her position had been eliminated by someone above her, and she continued the work. After the contact ended, she would learn it was Kowalski. He had fired a Barrett twice in training, both times at ranges under 500 meters. The southern personnel were at 640 meters. He had no spotter. He had taken the shot because she was on the lower shelf and the shelf was exposed, and there was no alternative that accepted that outcome. First round center mass. She stayed with Garrett. The contact lasted 31 minutes from initiation to resolution. The quick reaction force came in from the north, the approach vector that changed the contact's geometry decisively enough that the network personnel made the rational decision to withdraw. In the aftermath, Briggs ran his personnel check. Garrett was alive. The paralysis, which had been the critical unknown, the thing that the field could not determine and that only imaging could answer, was transient. By the time the medical evacuation reached him, sensation had returned to both legs. The radius fracture would require surgery. The scalp laceration had been managed in the field. Full recovery was the expected outcome. Everyone else was functional. Briggs looked at the team, at the equipment, at Tessa. He said, "Who fired the southern shot?" "Kowalski said I did, sir." Briggs said distance. Kowalski said Callard estimated 640. Briggs looked at Callard. On Shimoa. Callard said 630 to 650. I had eyes on it. Briggs looked at Kowalski for a moment. Then he said, "Good shooting." He looked at Tessa. She was finishing the post-contact medical assessment of the team, moving through the checklist with the methodical thoroughness that had become in the weeks since she had arrived, simply the way she moved through things. No editorializing, no performance of competence. The work done. Briggs said, not loudly, set it in the register of a decision that had been made and was being communicated. "Both of you, when we get back." She looked up. He held her gaze. He said the QRF commander is going to need a full accounting of this contact. When he asked who handled the medical and who handled the southern threat, I'm going to tell him that both were handled by personnel whose capabilities exceed their current designations. And I'm going to recommend accordingly. She said, "Sir," he said, "this is not a discussion. It is an accurate description of what happened." He held her gaze for another moment. He said, "Your father would have been impatient with how long the process takes." She said, "He would have said the work was its own justification." Briggs said he would have been right about that. In the after-action review, Briggs went through the contact geometry twice before he said what everyone in the room had arrived at independently. He said, "We were expected." The room held its silence. He said the physician's intelligence was accurate. The network's use of it was also accurate, which means the penetration is inside the radius of personnel who had access to the product after it was processed. Callard said the interpreter, not as a theory, as a conclusion reached before the contact ended. Briggs said he was the only non-cleared individual in the communication chain between the physician's information and this team's deployment order. Everyone else has full background and is inside the classification threshold. The interpreter was located within 4 hours and questioned by personnel with the appropriate authority for that kind of work. The answer was the one the team had already arrived at. Not ideology, not money, not political conviction. A brother being held by the network in a location the interpreter could not reach. An ultimatum delivered 2 weeks prior. A man who had spent 10 years helping American forces operate in his country, reduced by the specific leverage of family and threat to a single impossible choice. He had not been willing. He had been used. Tessa heard this in the briefing and stood at the edge of the room, looking at the map on the wall, thinking about the geometry of it, about how the network had found the lever and applied it and what it had cost, not this team specifically, but the man who had been used as the mechanism. She said his family needs to be relocated before the network learns he was caught. Briggs looked at her. She said whatever happens to him through the process, his family needs to be out of reach first. Briggs said, already in motion. She nodded. She left the briefing room. Later, after the QRF debrief and the documentation and the compressed logistics of a team returning from a complex operation, she found Prescott in the medical station and let him re-examine the wrists. The left had reopened slightly. The work on the lower shelf had stressed the sutures in the specific way of tissue being asked to hold under tension before it has fully knit. Minor. Prescott redressed it with the careful hands of a medic who has been thinking about these specific wrists since the morning he first treated them. He said without looking up from the work I heard about the lower shelf. She said it was the right call. He said, I know it was. That's not what I'm thinking about. She waited. He said, after 19 hours on a tree, you went over the edge of a position into incoming fire to reach a casualty. The first thing you said when you got to him was that you had him. She said that's what the situation required. He tied off the dressing. He sat back. He said the team has a name for you now. Started with Kowalski this morning, which means by tomorrow everyone in this building will be using it. She said, what is it? He said, both hands. She looked at him. He said, heal when you can, fight when you must. They've watched you do both in the same contact in the same 4-minute window. They're naming what they saw. She was quiet for a moment. She said, it's just what the work requires. He said, yes, it is. He said it in the way of someone who means something more than the agreement. Master Chief Leonard Cross arrived 2 days later. He came in on a supply flight from Bagram, traveling in the capacity that certain retired men of his caliber travel, in no official designation that required paperwork. The institutional acknowledgement that his judgment remained relevant to situations that his paperwork said he was no longer part of. He was 64 years old, had served for 32 years, and moved with the specific economy of a body that had performed at a high level for decades, and was managing the accumulated cost of that performance with the disciplined attention of someone who has no intention of stopping doing what matters to him. He arrived and was met by Briggs. They spoke privately for 20 minutes. When Briggs came out, he found Collard and nodded once. Collard went to find Tessa. She was in the medical station when Collard told her there was someone who wanted to speak with her. He told her the name. She went still for a specific moment, the kind of stillness that means processing rather than avoidance. She said, "Leonard Cross." Collard said, "Yes." She said, "He knew my father." Collard said, "He was your father's closest friend for 22 years. She said, "I know." My father talked about him. She set down the kit inventory she had been working through. She looked at her hands for a moment, not with anxiety, with the attentive quality of a person orienting before moving into something that matters. She went outside. Cross was in the courtyard, sitting on a low stone wall with a cup of coffee he had found somewhere and was holding without drinking. He was looking at the mountains to the east in the way that people who have spent significant portions of their lives in mountains look at them, not appreciating the view, but reading the terrain, the habit persisting long after the operational necessity for it. She came out and stood for a moment at the edge of the courtyard. He looked at her for a long time without speaking, with the quality of attention of a man who is not assessing in the usual sense, but looking for something more specific, the accumulated evidence of what a person has become. The product of years of choices and difficulties and commitments that leave their mark, not in a face or a posture, but in something less easily located and more reliably present. He found it. He found it in the way she stood, in the steadiness that was not constructed, in the eyes that were her father's eyes, not in their color but in their quality, the quality of eyes that have learned to see what is actually in front of them, rather than what the observer has brought to the looking. He said, "You look like him." She said, "People say that." He said, "I mean the parts that aren't in a mirror. The way you hold yourself." She came and sat on the wall across from him. He said, "I was going to come sooner. When Callard's message came through 6 weeks ago, I started making arrangements. I wanted to wait until there was a moment where coming meant something more than just showing up." She said, "He told me about you. Not often, but when he did, it was with the specific way he talked about people he trusted without reservation." Cross looked at his coffee. He said, "He told me about you, too, more than you might expect. He talked about the range sessions, about watching you learn something and then watching the learning disappear into who you simply were. He said it was the most remarkable thing he'd ever seen in a student, and he'd trained some serious people." She said, "He never told me that." Cross said he didn't need to tell you. That was the point. The people who need to be told they're doing something right are learning it. You weren't learning it, you were being it. The mountains were entering the evening transition, the peaks losing their light while the valleys below held on to it for the disproportionately long time. They always do, as though height is the variable that determines how long the light stays rather than its absence. She said, "He wrote in the letter that he wasn't worried about me." Cross said he wasn't. "He told me the same thing. He worried about a lot of people. He didn't worry about you." She said, "I read the letter this week. For the first time," he said, "I know. Callard told me." She said he was right. "I already knew." Cross said, "Yes. That's what he said you would say." They sat together in the quiet of the courtyard for a time that was long enough to hold what needed to be held. Not speaking much. The kind of silence that exists between people who share a grief and a pride in equal measure, and who have found in this particular place, in this particular evening, that the two things can occupy the same space without canceling each other. Eventually, he said, "Briggs's recommendation has been submitted and is moving through the process at the pace these things move. What comes out the other end will be what it is." She said, "I know." He said, "I want you to know, from someone who knew your father better than almost anyone living, knew him, that what you have done here is not a reflection of his record. It is an expression of your own." She looked at him. He said, "He gave you a foundation. Everything built on it is yours. The 19 hours on that tree, the lower shelf. The work you have done here for 7 years in the role you chose to honor your mother's request, all of it is yours." He set his coffee down. He said he would be proud. He was proud, actually. He told me so 2 weeks before the last deployment. He said he didn't know exactly what you were going to do with what he had given you, but that whatever it was going to be right. She looked at the mountains for a long moment. She said, "Thank you for being here." He said, "It's where I was supposed to be." They sat until the last light left the mountains and the courtyard was lit only by the ambient glow of the base. Then she stood and he stood, and they looked at each other in the way of people who have said what needed to be said and understand that the saying of it was not the end of the conversation, but the beginning of something that would continue in the particular way that important things continue quietly, persistently, in the way of the work rather than the way of ceremony. She went inside. He stayed in the courtyard a while longer, looking at the dark shapes of the mountains, holding something that had been with him for 13 years, and that was not lighter now, but was different in quality, resolved in the way that a debt you have carried for a long time is resolved not by being paid, but by being honored in the only way that matters, which is forward. 6 months later, Fort Bragg, North Carolina. February, with the cold that the Carolina Piedmont carries in winter. Not the brutal cold of high altitude, not the cold that strips the body and requires management to survive, but the settled, persistent cold of a season that has decided to be itself without apology. The trees bare. The sky, the specific gray of a day that will warm before it ends. The classroom was in a repurposed wing of a training facility on the south side of the installation, with windows along the eastern wall that brought in the morning light at a low angle and illuminated the room more warmly than the overhead fluorescence would have. Tessa stood at the front of it. 16 students looked back at her. A mixed cohort: Navy corpsmen, Army medics, 1 Air Force pararescueman, 2 Marine reconnaissance medics. Ages from 21 to 34. Experience ranging from none to 2 deployments. The common thread was selection. Each of them had been identified through their respective chains as candidates for something the existing training pipeline didn't contain. In the 6 months since Kunar, she had been doing 2 things simultaneously. The first was recovering. The ribs had knit. The wrist lacerations had closed to thin, pale lines that were already fading in the way of well-managed wounds that heal properly. The shoulder had been the longest project, 10 weeks of structured rehabilitation that she had approached with the same methodical commitment she brought to everything, and had returned to full function. She had gained back the weight she had lost in country, plus a modest additional amount from the rehabilitation nutrition protocol and the training she had resumed as soon as it was clinically appropriate. The circles under her eyes, which had been present for most of the previous 2 years in the specific way of a person managing too many things on insufficient sleep, were gone. The second thing she had been doing was building the curriculum. She had started writing it in the evenings during rehabilitation, in the hours after the physical work was done, and the base had quieted. She had started, as she started everything, with what was essential and the core of what was missing, the gap that the existing pipeline left unfilled, the specific and documented ways in which that gap had produced preventable outcomes in multiple operational theaters. Then she had built outward from the essential, adding complexity where the complexity was real and genuine, and stripping it where it was the complexity of bureaucratic process rather than operational necessity. Briggs had reviewed every draft. Callard had contributed the tactical integration sections. A senior medical officer at the Naval Medical Center had reviewed the clinical framework and had submitted as part of his formal assessment that this curriculum represented the most coherent integration of combat medicine and tactical decision-making he had encountered in his 20-year career, and that it addressed documented gaps with a specificity that suggested firsthand operational experience rather than theoretical synthesis. She had received this assessment and continued writing. The curriculum had been approved. The trial period was 2 years, 4 installations. The VA had already submitted a request to review the material for integration into their advanced training programs. 3 states were in the preliminary assessment phase. Stanton was in the 3rd row. He had returned from the surgical element at Bagram with a reconstructed shoulder and a recovery prognosis that the surgeons described as favorable, which was their way of saying that the repair had gone as well as it could go, given what had been repaired. He had enrolled in the pilot course through the appropriate channels with an application that included, in addition to the required documentation, a brief personal statement that he had written 3 times before he was satisfied with it. The statement was not required. He had included it because some things should be on the record. It said, among other things, that the person who had built this course had kept him alive when the situation had given the alternative every advantage, and that he intended to carry what she taught him forward in every situation for as long as he was capable of carrying it. He was in the third row and he was watching her, and he was thinking about a morning in a narrow valley where she had been 4 seconds from a Barrett to kneeling over him and had said 2 words in a voice that contained nothing, that did not belong in a voice when it was doing what her voice was doing. Stay with me. He was. The day before the course began, Kowalski had stopped her in the corridor outside her office. He said, "The VAA contact. I heard it came through. 3 states plus the pilot." She said, "The institutional process moved faster than I expected." He said, "Briggs pushed, and Cross made some calls." She said, "I know." He stood there for a moment with his arms not crossed. He said, "There's a phrase that's been moving through the community. Started at the forward base after the QRF came in. One of the QRF guys heard about the lower shelf and the way the contact was managed and used a phrase in the debrief that spread from there." She waited. He said, "Drag them out alive." It's shorthand for the integrated approach. The idea that the medic's obligation doesn't end with the immediate clinical intervention, but extends through everything that follows, including the contact that's still happening around the patient. He said someone wrote it on a whiteboard in the briefing room at the forward base in Kunar. It's still there. She was quiet. He said, "Your father would have said it was just the right way to do the job." She said he would have, and he would have been right. Kowalski said, "Yeah." He walked away. She watched him go, and she thought about the phrase, and she thought about the whiteboard in the briefing room in a valley in Kunar where everything had happened, and she thought about the word 11, what it contained, not just the biological fact of continued existence, but the fuller meaning, the one her father had built toward in everything he had given her. Alive in the complete sense. Present. Capable. Continuing. She went back to work. On the evening before the course's second week, she called her mother. She sat on the steps outside her quarters with the phone in her hand for a few minutes before she made the call. Not hesitating, orienting, she wanted to be entirely present for it. Her mother answered on the second ring. She said, "Tessa." Tessa said, "Hi, Mom." Her mother said, "How are you?" She said, "I'm good." Her mother said, "Actually good." She said, "Actually good, yes." Her mother was quiet for a moment, the specific quality of quiet that means processing rather than absence. Then she said something changed. Tessa said, "I opened the letter." The pause on the other end had a specific length long enough to hold the weight of what that meant, but not so long that it became an expression of being overwhelmed by it. Her mother said, "When she said in country, it came back to me after something. I opened it the same day." Her mother said, and she said he was right. "I already knew." Her mother said after a moment that was full without being long. "He said you would." She said, "You both knew." Her mother said, "He told me the morning after you came back from the range, when you were 14, you had been there since 6, and you came home sunburned and completely satisfied in the way that means the work went exactly right." He said, "She already knows who she is. We just have to not get in the way." She said, "He never told me that." Her mother said he didn't need to. That was the point. They talked for 40 minutes, not about operations or the course or the institutional processes that were moving at their own pace with their own timelines. They talked about the house and her mother's garden, and the winter, the ordinary continuation of a life that persisted and was good. Before they said goodbye, her mother said, "He would be proud of every decision you made." She said, "I know that now." Her mother said, "You've known it for years. You just needed the letter to confirm what you already understood." She said, "He wrote that." Her mother said, "He told me first." They said goodnight. She sat on the steps for a while after in the February cold that was cold but manageable, the kind of cold that requires awareness but not management. The base was settling into its evening rhythms. Generators, perimeter lights, the distant sound of a vehicle with somewhere specific to be. The ordinary persistence of a place that does not stop. She thought about her father. She thought about him with the specific quality that the grief had become over the years, not the raw, acute weight of loss which had its time and its place, and had been fully present when it needed to be, but the transformed thing that loss becomes when you live with it long enough and work with it honestly enough. Not healed, because healed implies a return to a state that preceded the loss, and she was not that person and would not be. She was the person who had grown in the space the loss had opened, and growing in a space is not the same as filling it. The space remained. What changed was her relationship to it. She thought about what he had said in the letter. She thought about what it meant that everything he had written she had already known, that the knowing had been in her for years, expressed in every choice she had made, in every difficulty she had moved through, and every time she had put her hands to the work that was in front of her, rather than the work she had imagined would be in front of her. She thought about Stanton in the third row. She thought about Garrett, who was in physical therapy in Virginia, and was walking without assistance, whose spinal injury had been transient in the way that spinal injuries sometimes are when the person they belong to has had adequate care quickly enough. She thought about the farmer in the irrigation field whose femoral artery had been packed and whose life had continued because of 90 seconds of work on a cold morning in October. She thought about the physician in the village whose intelligence had produced 3 operational results that the chain had assessed as significant, whose son had not been brought back by any of it, but whose information had prevented other sons from being lost. She thought about what the phrase "drag them out alive" contained when you opened it all the way up. She stood and went back to the work. On a morning 3 weeks into the course, a message came through Briggs. He forwarded it without comment, which was itself a form of commentary. The message was from the operational planning element that held jurisdiction over the type of mission the team had conducted in Kunar. It contained a briefing schedule, a reporting location, a clearance requirement, and at the bottom of the standard template language, a single line in the specific notation used for personnel with specialized designations. Personnel bearing classification. Ghost 2 are requested to attend the initial briefing. She read it twice. She looked at the reporting date, 4 weeks out. She pulled up the course schedule. The second cohort was scheduled to begin in 7 weeks. The third cohort request from the VA and 2 additional military programs was in the final stage of approval. Stanton was already in preliminary conversations about a teaching role in the second cohort pending his rehabilitation timeline. The work was moving, it had momentum. It was early enough in its life that the momentum was still fragile in the way that new things are fragile, real, and real enough to become permanent, but not yet the kind of established fact that sustains itself without the continued attention that built it. 4 weeks out, she sat with this for a long time. Not in conflict, she understood both sides of the equation well enough that the conflict was more specific than a simple tension between 2 directions. It was the specific question of sequence. What does the work require next? She thought about her father. She thought about a man who had spent 21 years in asking that question and answering it in the specific way of someone who understood that the answer lived in the situation rather than in any principle applied to the situation from outside it. He had been wrong sometimes. He had made decisions he regretted. He had not been defined by either of those things because neither of them was what the work was about. The work was about the person in front of you and the moment you were in and the full application of what you had, both hands, always both hands to what the moment actually required. She closed the laptop. She went to the classroom. Stanton was in the 3rd row. The other 15 students were in their seats. The February light came through the eastern windows at its low angle and illuminated the room in the warm, honest quality of morning light that shows things as they are. She stood at the front. She said, "We spent the first 2 weeks on the primary assessment sequence and the tactical integration framework. Starting today, we're moving into scenario work, real-time decision-making under conditions that are designed to be more complicated than the conditions you are prepared for." She paused. She said, "The purpose of making the training harder than the situation is not to test you. It is to build something in you that will be there when the situation is what it is and not what you were told to expect. That something is not a technique. It is not a protocol. It is the ability to be entirely in the actual moment rather than the moment you prepared for." She looked at the room. She said, "Your preparation is real. Your skills are real. Everything we have built in these 2 weeks is real and matters. And none of it is sufficient without this, the presence of mind, to use what you have in the situation that is actually in front of you." She said, "Your hands can hold a needle and they can hold a rifle. They are the same hands. They are steady or they are not. And the steadiness is not about the task. It is about what you have built underneath the task in every hour of preparation and every decision made honestly and every moment in which you chose to remain in the real situation rather than retreat from it into the one you wished you were in." Stanton in the 3rd row was watching her with an expression that the rest of the class might have read as simple attentiveness. It was more specific than that. It was the expression of a man for whom everything she was saying had already been demonstrated in a valley in Kunar province in the space of 4 seconds when she had gone from a Barrett to kneeling over him and had said 2 words in a voice that contained nothing that did not belong in it. "Stay with me." He was still staying. She said both things at the same time in the right order. "That is what we're here to learn," she began. Outside the windows, the February morning was doing what February mornings do in the Carolina Piedmont. The cold persistent but not permanent, the light increasing incrementally as the sun climbed the sky, the long, slow movement of the season towards something different. The bare trees along the perimeter of the installation held their shape against the sky with the patient certainty of things that do not need to perform their endurance, because the endurance is simply present the way all the deepest things are present quietly, consistently, without announcement. The work was in the room. The work was in the hands. The work was in the 16 students and in the woman who was teaching them, and in the phrase on a whiteboard in a forward operating base in a valley in Kunar province where everything had happened, 3 words written by a soldier who had witnessed something he did not have a better way to name, still there after 6 months, surrounded by everything else the whiteboard had accumulated and held in the way of whiteboards in briefing rooms, which is permanent until the next thing replaces it and sometimes longer. Drag them out alive. That was the commitment. That was what both hands were for. That was what her father had given her, and what she had spent 15 years making entirely her own. Not an inheritance, not a legacy in the sense of a thing received, but a continuation in the only way that things worth continuing actually continue forward into the next moment, with everything you have in service of the person standing next to you. Steady hands, always steady hands. That was all. That was enough. That was everything.